Jason Reeves, kia ora.
Kia ora.
We're going to be talking about shipping. What sorts of innovations are we seeing in the area of shipping in sort of the post-COVID world, I guess?
Sure. Well, I think COVID's kind of accelerated the plans to have a more sustainable shipping fleet. So there's the move to renewables, and I guess kind of hydrogen is probably the one that's the most likely to take forth moving forward. And I think New Zealand's actually quite a good position in the sense that we can harvest in New Zealand green hydrogen that may be used in the future to power marine vessels across the globe. So that's quite encouraging from that perspective. And also, ships are building with a larger capacity so they can make less frequent stops at ports, kind of, scale economies. But I think the real thing is actually reducing emissions, carbon emissions, and probably the best way to do that is to have it utilise hydrogen or green hydrogen for shipping fleets.
When you look at New Zealand within the wider context of the world and shipping, I mean, how would you describe what New Zealand's shipping situation is, I suppose, at the moment?
Good question. I mean, I think we're somewhat vulnerable, and I think the large players in the country have long-term arrangements with shipping companies, so they're reasonably secure. But for small businesses, particularly SMEs, they're quite a vulnerable position because they live simply at the whim of the large shipping companies. They're not in a position to directly negotiate or to command vessel space. So it's been quite challenging through the whole COVID period, whereby ships are being rerouted to more lucrative routes. So we've kind of been starved to a certain extent of regular shipping schedules over the past two or 3 years.
Well, because New Zealand is not a lucrative route to a big shipping company.
I wouldn't say it's not as lucrative as other markets. And certainly through the COVID period, the kind of the west coast of the US and the east coast of China was the most lucrative port. So you had vessels that were going up and down. Less vessels coming to this part of the world, which meant a real challenge from people going to supermarkets or to Mitre 10 and finding shelves half empty, etc., or to exporters struggling to get vessel space to send their goods to market. That's been a real challenge for SME businesses over the last 2.5 to 3 years. It's improved slightly from what it was, say, 18 months ago, but I think it's going to remain a challenge for New Zealand moving forward unless we can make it a more attractive environment for shipping companies to call upon New Zealand in more regular, frequent visits.
Lay it out for me. Tell me about what has happened in the shipping sector since the beginning of 2020 and just how dramatic COVID has been, I suppose, Because I guess there may be, people may be thinking to themselves, well, I could still get products. I could still get products from overseas. That was the thing that I was doing. I was at home watching TV and buying stuff from, all around the world. The shipping companies must have made a mint out of this.
Yeah, they did. But just to go back to your earlier question, perhaps give a bit of a sort of situational context to kind of explain to make it a little bit easier. Prior to COVID, the shipping industry was a very low profitable industry. I know that sort of sounds counterintuitive at the moment. And in fact, they were actually retiring vessels because there was too much supply and not enough demand at the time. That just happened at the same time as COVID. And through the COVID response, most central banks around the globe put copious amounts of money into the environment, made loans cheap, etc. So there was this massive stimulus of demand right across the globe. And I think we estimated that global trade increased by something in the region of 4%. Now, I'm not sure what the actual figure is, but it's a monumental figure anyway. And so you had factories that, producing goods on a grand scale. You had, ships that were going all across to China and the US to cater for this large demand. And you sort of found that there was a massive shortage of vessel space. And so kind of law of supply and demand, or capital goes to where it gets its greatest return. So we were kind of, I wouldn't say we were starved, but we were certainly had a reduction in the amount of vessels that came into New Zealand because they could ply their trade and get better returns elsewhere. So that was a real challenge for SME businesses. Large businesses had kind of confirmed contract with shipping companies, so they managed to, maintain a reasonably consistent shipping schedule. But for small businesses, they had really, really struggled to, one, get their inward goods into the country to make their finished products, and then to get the finished products out to export markets. That was a real challenge. And I think it has improved to a certain extent. But I think the fundamentals remain. We just need to make New Zealand a more attractive destination for the shipping companies to call upon at regular visits.
Well, let's talk about some of the ideas, particularly the more out-of-the-box ideas that you have to make that happen. And perhaps counterintuitively, one of them is taking it offshore. You traitor! Taking it offshore. I mean, I was fascinated when I read about this in the first place. You've written a piece where you talk about this. What's your idea here?
So this is, blue sky thinking.
Blue sky thinking, with that caveat.
Sure. But I think if we had looked at it from the perspective, as mentioned a little bit earlier, an attractive destination for shipping companies. So most of the ships that come to this part of the world either leave China or Singapore, Malaysia. They're large transshipment ports. And I guess for a large shipping company to take your cargo and to release it as few ports as possible and then get back to the original destination is probably the most efficient way to run your business. So in New Zealand, we have 12 ports for 5 million people. Germany has 83 million people and 2 ports. So I think it's fair to say that we don't have the most efficient use of ports in New Zealand. So I was thinking, and I do that occasionally, maybe if there was a port on the east coast of Australia, say somewhere in between Sydney and Melbourne, that could be called, for example, Destination New Zealand, for argument's sake. Right. And so you're a large shipping company, you could offload all of Australasia's cargo, or 90% of it, Sydney, New Zealand, Melbourne. How efficient would that be to offload your cargo, then go back to Singapore to fill up with more cargo again? And also for the New Zealand side, to maintain a shipping industry in New Zealand, a vibrant one, have coastal shipping from New Zealand to go to that super port in Australia to pick up the cargo to deliver to New Zealand's regional ports. Okay. I mean, you probably have, on the normal course of events, you probably have shipping companies service to New Zealand ports at regularly scheduled intervals. So say, for example, it could be Tauranga in the North Island and perhaps Littleton in the South Island, But I don't think necessarily want to call on 12 ports. So for a port like Nelson, I think it would be quite a sensible idea to say, okay, we can have coastal ships that go from Nelson to the port in Australia on a regular basis. It provides us with surety in terms of we're getting volumes into our city, provides employment for the ports. It provides some stability for the local growers in that region to say, yes, ships are going to come, pick up our cargo, take it to Australia, we can get put onto the large vessels and taken to export markets. So I think it sort of serves that purpose quite well, having a coastal shipping fleet feed into that super port, if you like, on the east coast of Australia.
You mentioned we have 12 ports. You seem to be suggesting there in a way that 12 is too many.
I think for 5 million people, 12 ports is a lot of ports. I understand why there. For example, Nelson, it's the fruit bowl of New Zealand, right? So you want to have a port nearby. But I just think from the eyes of a large shipping company that when they may be planning out their schedules for the year, thinking, well, we go from Singapore to New Zealand, there's a lot of ocean and not much ports in between from Singapore to New Zealand. Do we really want to go to and add on to that, to go as far south as Bluff in the South Island or Nelson, when really we could like to get discharge our cargo at ideally 1 or maybe 2 ports in New Zealand, i.e. Tauranga or Littleton. So I think for that perspective, you need to make quite a compelling case for them to visit those ports.
I suppose that's the reality of being New Zealand in sort of a global environment, isn't it? Is that you have to make an effort to make yourself more appealing to the big companies.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think for the large New Zealand companies that had the foresight to get into long-term contract with shipping companies, but that was great in hindsight. But for small companies that are never going to be in that position, they need a bit more certainty. And if you're an exporter in New Zealand and you had guaranteed shipments going out, whether they go via a port in Australia or not, that's sort of secondary. It's just knowing that you've got confirmed space on a vessel to take your goods to market. That's the real concern for them.
You mentioned the idea of coastal shipping before. I mean, how would you describe New Zealand sort of, I suppose, using the Great Blue Ocean as the substitute highway for trade, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, they're at the point, for example, we don't have a great roading infrastructure in New Zealand, so if we could remove some of that, the congestion on the roads and put it on and improve our coastal shipping, I think that would be sensible. I mean, we did have at one stage a coastal shipping fleet in New Zealand that's sort of kind of been disbanded, but it's coming together now. I see that there's a couple of, I think Maersk are going to start doing some regional shipments in New Zealand, and I think a local New Zealand freight forwarding company has also started to do some internal movement of cargo from one port to another. So I think we are seeing it, but I think we need to have it on a more grand scale. To make it more, meaningful for businesses right across the country. And now, whether that was to feed into the port in Australia or those 2 major ports in New Zealand, Littleton or Tauranga, I think that would also be useful.
We should talk about Auckland, which is kind of the elephant in the room here, I suppose, and the complexion there is kind of changing week to week, it seems. I mean, where are things at from your perspective with Auckland? The situation at the moment is not really tenable. Something has to change, surely. Yeah,
I think just first of all, Auckland is an import port, so there's very few cargo that gets sent out of Auckland. Sure. So it's an import port. The exports get out of Tauranga. But yes, needs a bit of work, Auckland ports, right? So they're talking about, is there going to be a second port? Is it going to be somewhere else? Is it going to be Thames? We've even heard about perhaps an Onehunga on the Manukau harbour, but then you've got the challenge of the sandbar, etc. Or, of course, we're also hearing about Northland. I mean, I think Northland's actually quite a sensible suggestion because it's one of our 2 natural deep water ports in New Zealand. You don't have to have vessels constantly dredging the waterways. I guess the only kind of proviso was that, or the major proviso, is that there need to be a dramatic improvement in the infrastructure, both for road and rail from Whangarei to Auckland. But I don't think that's insurmountable. And I kind of think we think of the big picture rather than what's kind of immediately in front of you, that we need to really prioritise the importance of exporting. In other words, getting our goods to market. How can we easily facilitate that? And to me, Northport's a real option to do that, right? It's going to require some infrastructure to get there, but that's it's in a long-term interest, I think, to do so. Because Auckland, the population's grown from when the port was established 100 or whatever years it was now. It's in prime real estate. You could argue that's not the best use of real estate in Auckland to have, second-hand Japanese cars sitting on it.
I'm trying to think of someone who's watching this conversation who maybe owns an import-export SME, something along those lines. Are there things that these companies can do to manifest more control over their fortunes, to become more masters of their own destinies from your point of view?
Yeah, and I think they have. They've been pretty, nimble throughout the whole COVID. Examples I can notice of is vessels that come off at Nelson and Picton, roll on, roll off.
Yeah.
Well, they've done roll on, roll off cargo because they can't find vessel space, they can't find containers, so they'll simply just put their cargoes on the ship like a roll on, roll off. They've done that. They've had break bulk shipping, which is non-containerised shipping. So it may be cargo that's sitting on top of containers or at the side of a ship, etc. These things that you wouldn't normally consider unless you had a situation where you just, there was no other option but to do that, to get your goods to market. So they've been pretty nimble throughout the whole COVID period. And I think they've also worked together to say, hey, can we create critical mass? Can we partner with a group of SMEs and then negotiate directly with shipping companies? Yeah. That's kind of had limited to date because even when they pull the resources, they're still not huge in many cases. But we've also seen examples of where they wanted to also charter vessels, large cargo vessels to ship goods to markets, aircraft. For a small business, that's a huge step to undertake, to want to actually consider chartering aircraft. But I think they've got to the stage in many cases where customers' patience is kind of, I wouldn't say it's run out, but I think it's they're getting a little impatient with kind of COVID. In other words, other parts of their business, they've just said, well, we're continuing on. We know that COVID was a distraction for a period of time. We can live with that for a period of time, but ultimately we've got businesses to run. Your goods need to be here like everybody else's. And if you can't do that, maybe we'll consider doing something else. Now, we haven't seen that. We haven't seen examples yet of people substituting New Zealand products for others. But I'm saying that that would be the worst scenario if it ever got to that stage, because we would have trouble getting our goods to market to meet delivery times or schedules from our offshore customers. So that's a kind of that's a real fundamental, that came back to my earlier point, to kind of emphasise the importance of supporting the export sector, given it produces 25% of our GDP. And most businesses, exports are SME business. So 97% of our businesses are SMEs, right? So I think we can do arguably more to support those. They can do what they can do. But they'll also need a bit of help, I think. Yeah.
And just finally on this, and we'll take your passport at the door for suggesting that we port to Australia. But what are the things that you're going to be keeping an eye on in the sort of short to mid-term, the big opportunities, I suppose, in this kind of sphere that you would urge people who either work in this sector or who are looking to invest in this sector to really keep an eye out for?
I think it may be a few years away, but I'm quite excited about New Zealand's prospects producing green hydrogen. Right. Because I think for major transport fleets, be it trucking, aircraft and marine vessels, I think that's a real viable option to replace carbon fuel. And I think New Zealand is in a very invidious position that we can actually produce green hydrogen. So we can get an energy source, be it from geothermal, be it from hydroelectric. So we can kind of hand on heart say it's a renewable source of green energy. We're not burning fossil fuels to get the source to create hydrogen. So I think that has enormous opportunity for New Zealand. I think initially it'll be for trucks, roading fleets, but that may roll out also to aviation and to marine. And I just see recently the first trial shipment of hydrogen was sent from Australia to Japan, because many countries, Japan, Germany, Korea, have kind of placed their bets on hydrogen as the fuel, if you like, to replace fossil fuels for their transport industry.
Well, and I suppose this is one of those things. Every single business that exists has to consider its environmental impact now. It's something that you simply cannot get away from, and I guess that sort of represents an opportunity if you're a country like New Zealand. Absolutely.
I think it's an absolute opportunity. And I also think for SME businesses, I think continuing to collaborate with each other and present a kind of coherent voice, I think that's really, really essential. That started through necessity, through COVID. We've got some great champions in New Zealand from small businesses that are engaging with the sector to fight for their interests, because I just don't think we're going to go back to, I guess you call it the good old days. So I mentioned earlier in the discussion that prior to COVID, shipping was not a particularly profitable industry. It's become profitable. It's become a profitable industry, obviously. And I don't think we've seen the prices of freight being astronomical. Certainly they come off those absolute heights, but it's still very high compared to 3 or 4 years ago. I just don't think we're going back to where we were 4 years ago. So for all businesses, I'm sort of kind of prepping them to say that, yes, we're going to come off our elevated prices that we are now, but I would be saying it's probably going to be 20 or 30% more than it was 3 or 4 years ago. And that's why, at the earlier point, we need to make it attractive for shipping companies. They've built vessels over the last 3 or 4 years. They've sunk enormous amount of capital to build these vessels. They want to get a return on their investment, so they're not going to get it by going back to pricing levels of 4 years ago. So I just think that's for businesses moving forward to kind of, when they look to go doing international business and consider their freight costs, etc., I think they want to be cognizant of that.
The real take home, as it is in many things, is sort of adapt or die.
Yeah. And we're resourceful. I mean, Kiwis by nature, right? We do a lot with less. We're resourceful, and the good thing about it, we have a look at the whole, dislocation with supply chains through COVID. I think exports were, the merchandisable exports, things you can touch and feel, they were going about 1.5% year-on-year increase, even through the 3 years of COVID, which is quite remarkable given the constraints.